This story occurred in January of 1988. A man named Michael had an extremely important business meeting in the upper part of Manhattan in New York City. Michael had been a very important businessman for his company and would often take flights all over the country. A lot of these flights would be red-eye flights due to the last-minute nature of the business he had to take care of. The red-eye flights always seemed to put him behind schedule in many respectives. Not only would they occasionally make him miss his meetings, they would oftentimes force him to stay in hotels that he would rather not stay in. And this was just another example of that. Michael was forced to stay at the Red Coach Inn due to the fact that occupancy in all other hotels in Manhattan had been full. Michael had heard about the Red Coach Inn. He couldn't necessarily pinpoint what it was about this hotel that made it so unique. Michael had been a rather busy man. It was always work for him, so he seemed to have a tough time remembering any details about anything other than making his way up the corporate ladder. Well, I should rephrase that. It was work and women for him. Even though he was a married man, Michael sadly did not shy away from committing adultery if the occasion called for it. So when he landed in New York and met up with a woman for some drinks, this was not out of the ordinary. During the outing, he had mentioned to this woman that he was staying the night at the Red Coach Inn, just a few blocks from the bar that they were at. The woman laughed diabolically and informed Michael that he was staying at a haunted hotel. They both had a few laughs at the fact that he was going to die. The woman claimed Michael was going to get skinned alive and left to rot, according to how the legend went, while animating her hands as if she was stabbing him with a knife. They both continued laughing. Michael hadn't ever believed in ghosts. He never had time to believe in that kind of stuff. But it did trigger his memory of the hotel and where he had heard of it. The Red Coach Inn was a very old and decently large hotel that had many different stories surrounding its lore, and Michael still couldn't pinpoint how the story went. He thought maybe he never actually heard of its lore, rather that it was just haunted in general. Michael and his date parted ways after a fun night of drinks, and he was definitely feeling the effects of those drinks. Michael was still coherent, but stumbled his way across the city streets and into the Red Coach Inn. As he walked into the massive lobby of the hotel and began heading towards the elevator to get to his hotel room, he stopped. He turned towards the receptionist in his drunk state. She was politely behind the counter of the reception area, smiling at him. Michael walked to the receptionist and asked her what the real story was with the hotel, and that he heard rumors of it being haunted. She politely declined the knowledge of any real hauntings, but after a few exchanges, and finding out that Michael was staying on the 8th floor, the receptionist grew a worried look. Well, what I can tell you is that there's a hotel room on that floor that has no room number. It is locked, and absolutely no one is allowed in there. Do not stop to stare at it, and definitely do not knock on it. Michael continued to press for more information about this room, but the receptionist shrugged him off and told him he needs to get some sleep. Michael was angry at that claim, but knew that she was right. Once Michael arrived on his floor, his mind was wandering all over the place, from his work meeting in the morning to his wife back home in California. His mind was everywhere, but on the so-called haunted hotel. That was until he passed the room with no number. He heard noise coming from this room. His curiosity grew. He wanted to knock so bad since it was supposed to be empty. But he decided to follow the receptionist's piece of advice and go straight to his room and straight to sleep. He then heard whimpering coming from the other side of the door. His drunken curiosity got the best of him. The door handle had a rather large keyhole, so he decided to peek into it. Cold air passed through the keyhole, chilling his eye. He had to blink it out. What he saw was a hotel room, like the one he was staying in, and a woman with completely white skin was standing in the corner, facing the wall. This was a bit startling to Michael, not only because he was told the room was completely empty, but because of the woman's skin. It appeared to be abnormally white to him. He stared in confusion for a while before continuing to his room down the hallway. The following morning, after Michael's work meeting, he began to head back to his hotel. The business offer was accepted by the client, and that meant that Michael would have the next couple of days to explore the city with no more serious work to handle, outside of some paperwork that he could take care of within his hotel room. His boss tried to maneuver around to get him a new room somewhere in Manhattan, somewhere a little more luxurious, but according to his boss, anything nicer than the one that he already had was fully booked. However, this didn't bother Michael, as he hadn't necessarily planned to stay in his room for long periods of time anyway. He already had plans to head out for the afternoon for some more drinks with the same woman as the previous night. Michael arrived back at the Red Coach Inn, and during his walk back to his hotel room on the 8th floor, he passed the numberless room again. No noise came from it this time. Michael pressed his ear up against the door just to double check that he could not hear anything. Silence. He was unsure if he had just conjured up the events that had happened the night prior. He shook his head and continued moving. Later that night, after enough drinks to make him nearly forget what city he was in, Michael made it back to the entrance of his hotel. It was a bit after midnight at this point, and on his way to the elevator, he passed the same receptionist from the night before. In his drunken state, he yelled to her that he heard noises coming from that supposedly vacant room. She assured him that he was mistaken and that the room was empty, but Michael wasn't having it, and was being rather rude to the woman behind the counter. The elevator on the 8th floor opened up, and Michael stumbled out of it. He smacked his knuckles against the door with no number several times as he passed the room. "Anyone home?" he yelled, then began laughing to himself as the room was now behind him. No noise was coming from inside the room from what he could tell. But in his curiosity, Michael turned around, went over to the door, knelt over, and once again peeked into the large keyhole. It looked as if someone had taped the other side of the keyhole with red masking tape to prevent someone from looking in. "Son of a..." Michael said to himself. He continued trying to peer through the red tape as, on occasion, he felt that he could see something moving. Michael wondered how the occupant of the room, or maybe the hotel staff, had already known that he peeked in the night prior. But they must have known somehow. He shrugged it off, smacked his knuckles against the numberless door once more, before heading into his room to pass out. The next morning, Michael had felt horrendous from the previous night's drinking events. But he had plans to get brunch with a coworker before going to happy hour at one of his favorite restaurants in Manhattan, so he had to get moving. It was still quite early in the morning, so the receptionist had still been there from the previous night. He had a few moments before his cab arrived at the front of the hotel, so he decided he wanted some questions answered. "Look, I peeked through the keyhole, okay? I'm sorry, but I did. Now tell me what's really going on. What happened in that room?" The receptionist, with anger in her eyes, questioned why he would do such a thing. She had warned him to avoid that room at all costs. But if he must know, a woman had killed her husband in that room 5 years ago, then took her own life, all after finding out that he was committing adultery. So they supposedly haunt that room then? Michael questions. The receptionist shakes her head yes. The legend goes that anyone who knocks on that door winds up disturbing the entity of that woman. Then, who knows? There are many different versions. Michael looked a bit flustered at this theory. He was ready to get going as the cab was pulling up. In fact, he was ready to get out of the Red Coach Inn altogether after all this crazy talk. He had one more night in New York before flying home, and he planned to contact his boss to ensure he got him into a new hotel by the end of the night. "One more thing," the receptionist mentions as Michael is turning around to leave. Anyone who spotted the couple entering the hotel the night that everything happened claimed that they weren't normal. I have a very reliable coworker that had been working that night that could confirm this. She said that their entire bodies were completely white, except their eyes. Their eyes were red. A few weeks later, a woman decided to go out for some drinks with a group of her friends at a local dive bar. They did this every Wednesday night as it was a nice release from their chaotic work lives. The Manhattan News had kicked on the TV behind the bar. The news described the finding of a man's body. This poor guy had been found in a Manhattan alleyway, completely skinned. The woman hushes all of her friends. Shh, shh. This sounds crazy, but I know this man.